sit down and meet personally and directly with Merrick Garland, President Obama's nominee for the vacancy on the U.S. Supreme Court. I've read so much about him and his background in his life and his professional career. He is clearly a person well qualified to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. I think that's one of the problems that the Republicans have. They just know that when they sit down, get to know him, and understand his background, it's virtually impossible to say this man is not qualified to serve in that position. We talked a lot about his background in his family and his background in the Chicago area. The great irony of this is that his grandparents, one of them came from Lithuania, immigrated to the United States almost the same year as my grandparents, coming through Baltimore, which was an unusual venue for many immigrants coming to this country, as my grandparents did as well. So we talked about that. It was a coincidence which we didn't know before the meeting. But we also talked about his growing up in the Chicagoland area, what life was like in his family, and then we got into some issues that were important to me. He was careful in answering, as all Supreme Court potential nominees would be, but I thought made it clear in a few sentences his grasp of the law and his understanding of the legal principles that are brought into these important cases involving so many aspects of our Constitution and of our government. This is the 6th Supreme Court nominee that I've sat with in my office. I've given each of them the same book. It's called Taming of the Storm by Jack Bass. It's the biography of Frank Johnson. Frank Johnson was a district court judge in the state of Alabama during the Civil Rights era. When John Lewis took me on a walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, he turned to me at one point and said, there's one man who doesn't get enough credit for the civil rights movement, and it's federal judge Frank Johnson. So I read his biography and thought enough of it that I've given it to each of the Supreme Court nominees who's come to see me, because I believe it's an extraordinary story of not only legal talent but courage for a federal judge who stood up at a moment in American history and made a difference, a real difference. John Lewis said there would never have been a Selma March were it not for Judge Frank Johnson, and I read the book and feel the same. So I've given that to Merrick Garland today, Judge Garland today, in the hopes you'll have a chance to read it and to feel as strongly as I do about its message. Let me say a word about where we are politically. I don't understand the Republican position when it comes to Merrick Garland. The Constitution's clear. The President has a responsibility to nominate someone to fill a vacancy on the U.S. Supreme Court. The Constitution is also clear that the role of the Senate is to advise and consent on that nominee. That's not a guarantee that any nominee is going to be approved by the Senate, but it is basically a direction to the Senate to do your job, do your duty, advise and consent to this presidential nominee. What we have today is a decision by the Senate Republicans to ignore the Constitution that they've sworn to uphold and defend, and to ignore the history of the United States Senate, where no presidential nominee to the Supreme Court has ever been denied a hearing. Never, never. And yet they are saying they're going to deny a hearing to this man, Merrick Garland. What's behind it? Sadly, it's a disrespect for the Constitution, and that is a terrible commentary on this decision. But equally, it's a disrespect to the presidency. This president is the elected leader of our nation. That wasn't a decision just made by Republicans or just made by Democrats. It was made by the American people. Over 3 years ago, when the president won by a margin of more than 5 million votes and was given the opportunity to lead our nation, not for 3 years and 2 months, but for 4 years. There's nothing in our Constitution and nothing in the precedent of the Senate that says in the last year of a presidency, a president cannot make an appointment to the Supreme Court. In fact, the Senate Republicans have to ignore Justice Anthony Kennedy, who was approved by the Democratic Senate when nominated by a Republican president in the last year of his presidency. So they have to ignore that to say to Merrick Garland he will not get his day before the Judiciary Committee. I've served on this committee. I think Merrick Garland deserves an opportunity to take the oath, to sit in the chair, and to answer the questions of senators from both political parties. Then let those senators vote as they wish. Let them vote their conscience. But to deny him an opportunity to even be heard, an opportunity to defend himself if there are any charges, that is fundamentally unfair. It is unfair by the standards of this nation, by the standards of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I'll do everything in my power to urge my colleagues to step forward and break ranks with Senator McConnell and to stand by the Constitution, stand by the precedent and history of the United States Senate, and give Merrick Garland his day.